All right. So it looks like we got everybody back. Hopefully, you got a chance to introduce yourselves a little bit and discuss some of this, just how you see anxiety, how you see stress talked about. So I'd love to get your feedback here in the chat. If people want to just go ahead and put in things that their groups mention, how have you heard stress talked about? How have you heard anxiety talked about at APU? Feel free to put stuff in chat and we'll kind of call them out. Talked about more in psych classes than in gen eds. Absolutely. Um, I know I'm personally biased as having my PhD in clinical psych. Talking about it in FYS classes, some too. Definitely folks talking about a lot of resources, so that's good. It was brought up in chapel as well. I know it's brought up a few times in chapel. Reverend Dr. Fortson, I think, got to talk in chapel for that one, which I think was great. Glad to see that some folks are seeing that this is talked about a lot on APU campus, but other folks probably not as much, depending on the kind of classes you're taking. It seems what I'm getting. Definitely made it clear that we have a lot of resources. And so I'm glad to hear that. The counseling center is definitely a place with a lot of resources, but I know too sometimes it's a little weird when we just let you know about resources. Sometimes you might not feel like you have the time to access those resources, or sometimes you just might hope that you have some resources that you can use on your own, without having to reach out. So hopefully that's something that we could really address today and give you some more resources. So, but first, before we go into that, I wanted to talk about that first point I made, our first goal for today, which was to talk a little bit more about stress and anxiety in general, right? And so, this being APU, right? We have our scriptural background here. A couple things that I want to highlight. Sometimes I've heard, folks really worried that like having worries, that having stress, having anxiety makes them bad for some reason or is a negative thing, right? And I want to kind of challenge that. Those of you that are coming from a Christian tradition, we even see that Jesus experienced anxiety and fear, right, in his life on earth. So it's clearly not a bad thing to go through. And yet we also have God here for us, right? We can cast our worries and our anxieties on him. And so prayer is an extremely powerful tool for those of you that use prayer and that it's important to you. But I also want to talk about some other tools today, that more psychological tools that everyone hopefully can use as well. But what do we mean when we talk about anxiety? What makes anxiety, typical anxiety, the anxiety that we all feel as students, especially as students in this time of remote learning, different from, maybe more intense anxiety, clinical anxiety? And so I have a couple of series of cartoons here from White Swan that I think can help outline that, right? So generally when you're feeling regular amounts of anxiety, you're really worried at the start of something, right? This person's really worried about the start of the test, but once they get going on the test, they feel a little bit better. They get into a groove, right? This is different than like severe test taking anxiety, right? Where you never find yourself getting into that groove, and it can find it blocking you from even being able to finish the test, right? Even being able to put answers on paper. A similar thing might be, public speaking fears, right? We're all very nervous. I'm nervous every time I do one of these presentations for you all, um, getting ready to get up in front of you. And once I get started, though, usually I hopefully hit my flow a little bit, and hopefully that's true for you all as well. You're still nervous, but you get through the presentation, right? But then there's the kind of anxiety where you can't even, get to that presentation, right? Where you end up getting so stressed out about not being able to present that you, in this, cartoons, hide in the bathroom instead of going to the class, or just skip the class where you're supposed to present, right? And so you're seeing levels of differentiation, and it's all based on what we like to call functional impairment, right? So when your anxiety gets stronger and stronger, the stronger it gets, the more it's going to interrupt the things that you're doing in your life, right? The things that you want to get done, the tasks that you have. And so I want that you all to focus on that kind of thing as you're thinking about anxiety, and what you should do about anxiety, and when you should try and deal with it on your own, or when you might want to seek additional help, is how much is it interfering with your day-to-day life? One last one on checking locks, right? We may have that normal anxiety, when we're getting ready for bed. Oh, did I check the lock? Make sure everything's good to go. And you go back, you get up and you check it again, even though you checked it once before, but then you get in bed and you fall asleep, right? It's very different than this obsessive anxiety of having to check it constantly, 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 right? And so, again, functional impairment, the ability to go to sleep versus the ability to have to keep checking your locks over and over again. And the reason that I bring this up is actually because it's fairly, unfortunately, common for college students to be experiencing stress and anxiety, right? So these are some APU specific statistics from the most recent National College Health Survey. These are actually a little bit older statistics now. They're the most recent I have access to, but these are all pre pandemic as well. So you imagine that some of these may have increased. And these are students in the last 12 months, 91% of folks have felt overwhelmed at some point or another, and then on and on, various levels of thing, right? You see anxiety, a full 66% of folks have experienced a significant amount of anxiety at least one point in the last 12 months. And so what are we going to do about this? How can we solve this? That's hopefully why you're here, and that's why we're here too, right? So I want us to talk about tools. This whole toolbox metaphor, you may have heard, like, when every all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. It's a classic idiom. Maybe you have heard it, maybe you haven't. But basically, the number of tools that we have, the different strategies we have, will affect how we're able to interact with our world, right? And so I want to teach you three different tools today, because some of you may be really in need of grounding, whereas some of you may be really in need of progressive muscle relaxation. You maybe hate grounding, but decatastrophizing is really helpful for you, right? So as we go into these next three skills, I really want you to focus on what is going to work best for you and how you can personally use these things in your life. And so we're going to do a couple more discussions as well along those lines. But the first thing we're going to do is talk about panic attacks, right? So you may have heard the term panic attack or anxiety attack a lot. Um, Sometimes we use these terms very interchangeably, and there are technical psychological definitions, but they don't really matter that much. They're not that interesting to your day to day life. More, I want to talk about what panic is, right? When we panic, it's when some kind of stress or anxiety overwhelms us to the point where we're starting to really feel the fight or flight reflex, right? Where we're really starting to find our hearts beating faster, right? Maybe we're hyperventilating, breathing really fast. You get sick to your stomach. You may feel really hot or really cold, sweats, trembling, dizziness, all of these kinds of things, uncontrollable crying, things like that. And this is when we start to just get absolutely overwhelmed, right? And we break down emotionally. And one of the tricky things about panic is when we're really activated like this, like, we almost start to reference back to our internal experience, right? The faster my heart's beating, now I'm not just worried about whatever got my heart beating fast in the first place. I'm also worried about how fast my heart's beating and whether or not my heart's okay. And, like, whether or not, this pain in my side or whatever should be something freaking me out, right? So all of these things, these are internal cues, right? Your internal sensory experience. And fortunately or unfortunately, right, a panic attack only can last a few minutes, right? Our body only has enough energy, really, if we get started in a panic attack, to maintain that panic attack for a little while, because it's highly energy taxing, right, to have your heart beating that fast. But we can accidentally prolong the duration of a panic attack when we start paying attention to those internal cues, right? When we start paying attention to how our muscles are feeling, or how dizzy we are, how much we're hyperventilating. And so we when we have a panic attack like that, specifically panic, that's where your whole, system is out of whack, there's one specific type of skills that I always recommend, and those skills are grounding techniques. So I'm actually going to share the first file with you guys in the chat right now. Let me go ahead and find it real quick. The grounding exercises handout. So hopefully you guys can all see it there. But grounding exercises, the whole point of a grounding exercise is it's anything that can take your senses away from those internal cues. Anything that can take your senses away from how fast your heart is beating, how quickly you're breathing, how dizzy you feel, and focus your senses on something else. Because then your body will naturally go through the panic attack up and back down again. And it'll be shorter and less impactful on you, right? So, um, one major grounding strategy is the 5 4 3 2 1 grounding or sensory grounding. You'll see that on the back of that sheet that I sent you. Um, but it basically works by cueing your senses into something you're in your environment, right? So I'm holding this cup here, right? And if I'm really freaking out, if I focus way too much of my attention on this cup, then it's going to help me not have enough attentional space left over to focus on what's going on inside of me, right? So I could pick up this cup and tell you every single visual information I can think about it. This cup is, it's about, I don't know, 6 inches tall. It's got the word Yeti printed on it. It's silver in color. It's sort of a brush silver. It has a plastic lid on it. And all of these things, way more than you need to know about this cup. It doesn't matter. But the point of the exercise is not about the cup, right? The point of the exercise is that I'm spending all of my attention on it, right? I can do a similar thing with how it feels, right? I can feel that it's round and it's very smooth because it's got a polished finish on it, but it's engraved right here with my initials and it's rough right where it's engraved. And then the lid has a totally different feel to it. It has a different temperature and texture because it's not metal, whereas the metal part feels kind of cool to the touch. The lid feels just, I don't know, I guess room temperature, right? Again, wasting everyone's time on a very, very descript investiture here into this cup. But because I'm doing that, I'm running out of extra space to panic with, right? So when you're going to be practicing this, it's going to feel a little weird at first, but it's going to be really effective when you're in those moments of panic because you'll not be able to have the attention elsewhere, right? And so on that grounding handout I gave you, there's a whole bunch of other ones too. You don't have to just do 5 4 3 2 1 grounding, right? There's some with like get a hot cup of tea, or there's some with, like name where you are right now, what your name is, things like that. All kinds of grounding activities. So hopefully we can find some that work specifically for you. We'll get to talk about that a little bit more in groups in a moment. But I want to go on before we break out into groups again to talk about our next skill, which is decatastrophizing, right? So catastrophe, right? Something that's really bad. And catastrophizing means when we work up in our mind that something is going to be really bad, right? So this comes out of a cognitive therapy kind of style, those of you that are interested in the psychology behind it. And from this point of view, from a cognitive point of view, how stressed we feel about our world is not necessarily just one to one correlated with what's going on in our world, right? But rather what we think about what's going on, right? Some of you may have experienced that feeling before where you think, oh, that person really doesn't like me. And so now I'm really nervous, right? Or I'm really frustrated or something like that. But then you get to talking to them later and you find out, oh, no, they were just being awkward that day, or they were just feeling sick and off and they have nothing against me at all, right? Okay, well, that's the same situation but totally different based upon what you think about that, right? Some other examples, I have listed on here specifically of catastrophizing when our brain gets ahead of itself and starts making everything terrible is when you fail that critical test, right? Instead of worrying about, okay, I failed this test, maybe I failed this class, I'm going to have to retake it. How am I going to figure that out? Right? You immediately go to thinking, I'm going to absolutely fail every test. I'm going to fail entirely out of college. I'll never end up anything. I'll never have a job. I'll never be successful. I'll be a total failure for my entire life, right? You clearly saw how I went to 0 to 100 on that, right? Similar thing, right? If I make a mistake, right? If I say something wrong, everyone will make fun of me. I'll never have any friends. I'm gonna die alone, right? This catastrophizing gets rolling like a boulder and picking up speed like a snow boulder, right? I don't know what you'd call that, snowball, moving down a hill. And so we need to find some way to stop this distortion of our world, right? Stop seeing everything through anxious colored glasses, as it were. Um, and so one way we can do that is decatastrophizing, right? We try to interrupt those catastrophic thoughts by saying, wait, is that real? Let's pause for a second, right? Putting in a stop a little bit in your thoughts and in your thinking. And I want to make sure that this is very clear that this is not like power of positive thinking. This is not just optimism, right? Because in fact, sometimes over optimism can get you in trouble too, right? If I think nothing will ever go wrong and I'm failing my test left and right, but I still think I'm going to, get a 4.0, clearly that's not going to happen. Clearly that's not helpful, right? So the goal of this decatastrophizing is to talk to yourself what is a realistic and reasonable outcome of what could happen here, right? uh, the power of realism rather than the positive thinking. I'm going to go ahead and throw another handout for you. I'll go ahead and put the decatastrophizing handout in the chat so you can take a look at that, and really reflecting on as much as you can the thought that if every time you thought the world was going to end because something that happened, if it did end every single time, none of us would be here, right? The world would have ended like a long time ago, right? So many things that you were worried about, you were making catastrophe in your mind in the past, were survivable, right? Because you've survived, because you're here, right? So I'm not trying to say that everything will be, and I'm not trying to say we should never get nervous about something, but we need to focus that nervousness in at a very specific level so that it's realistic and accurate, and that'll help us deal with our stress and anxiety a lot more. Okay, so I've been talking now for a very long time. I apologize for that. Um, I want to get us in back into our groups. So I'll send you back into your groups in a second, but I want us to go over both of these skills. So the first question is going to be related to grounding. So I want you to each take turns um, when you get into your groups doing that thing I was doing with my cup before, right? One thing you can see in the room around you or one sound you can hear or whatever. Everybody take a turn, and it'll feel a little silly at first, but just give me way too much information, give your group way too much information about whatever it is you can see, feel, touch, hear. Um, I see somebody in the chat saying that they're haven't gotten the worksheets. Are other people seeing the worksheets in the chat right now? Okay. I will see if I can help you out here in a second. The file is blank. That's not so good. Thank you all for letting me know. Which one is blank? Cannot open the files. You know what? I'll go ahead and while we're in our breakout groups, I will. Oh, Oscar's doing it for me right now. Thank you so much, Oscar. Um, if you're having trouble with the handouts, try downloading them in the PDF format and see if those will work better for you. Thank you so much, Oscar. You're on the spot with that. That's exactly what I was going to try as well. So you'll start by describing one thing that you can see, feel, hear, smell, taste, whatever. Give just too much information about it so that you can practice that grounding. And then look over that worksheet, right? Each of you talk through the worksheet and see which one of the things on the worksheet sounds like you. Which one sounds like you would want to try that the next time you're panicking. So that'll be the first exercise. And then the second exercise will be to share with your group about sometime you found yourself thinking overly catastrophic thoughts and how you got through it, what you challenged yourself, how you challenged that catastrophic thinking, or what ended up happening. You can look through the decatastrophizing handout as well if you'd like to see some uh, decatastrophizing stuff. So all right, I'll go ahead and send you to breakout rooms right now. Remember, starting with the grounding exercises, and then I'll message you when it's time to move on to the decatastrophizing.